Welcome to this ACUR ANU student presentation session. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past and present. My name is Yastika Banerjee and I will be chairing today's session. Our first presenter for today's session is Grace Lim. Please start when you're ready.
Can you guys see it? Good morning, I am Grace Lim and I will be presenting my research on rational actor and behavior models of decision making on the UK's decision to join the 2003 invasion of Iraq. On the 18th of March 2003, the British Parliament, led by the Prime Minister Tony Blair, approved the UK joining the invasion of Iraq by the United States, led by President George Bush. It was the first time in nearly 60 years that the UK took part in an opposed invasion and a full-scale occupation of a sovereign state, Iraq. UK's decision to join the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was and remains without doubt the most controversial foreign policy act of the British government in many decades. So, why did the UK join the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and which behavioral models of decision making, rational actor or behavioral, is more useful for explaining this decision? I found that by comparing rational actor and behavioral models of decision making in explaining UK's decision to join the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the behavioral model is better than the rational actor model in explaining the decision making process of Tony Blair that privileged alliance maintenance over domestic political constraints. First, I will discuss my research methods. Then I'll begin to analyze the UK's decision using the rational actor model, followed by the behavioral model. Finally, I will present my findings and implications of my research. For this qualitative research, I used the case study of the UK's decision to join the 2003 invasion of Iraq to compare the rational actor model and behavioral models of decision making. Rational actor model, RAM, is the most commonly used model for foreign policy analysis. It assumes that individuals make decisions based on rational calculations. BM draws from psychology and is often used as a foil for RAM, because while RAM tries to deduce how humans should act, BM seeks to infer the deeper structures of human reasoning. Although limited to open source information about the UK government's decision making and Prime Minister Blair's thought process, I was able to gather a lot of information from the report on the Iraq inquiry. I also use other secondary sources such as academic journal articles and some news articles. Using rational actor model of decision making, I will first present the rational calculation of UK's decision to join the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Blair initially delayed military action, hoping that the US would take action within a multilateral framework with international support. However, the invasion was not only a hugely unpopular decision in the international community, it also lacked a strong legal basis to justify force, because Blair failed to secure a second United Nations Security Council resolution permitting the use of force. Secondly, Blair faced strong domestic constraints from both parliamentary and public opposition. Finally, the invasion would disrupt the work of inspectors in assessing Iraq's compliance and intelligence on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, programs was limited and uncertain. In contrast, a successful invasion could effectively eliminate the danger to international peace and security from Iraq's WMDs and the associated programs and means of delivery, including prohibited ballistic missiles. Furthermore, Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein led a brutal and repressive regime with a pattern of gross violations of human rights and twice started wars costing more than 1 million lives in total. An invasion could achieve regime change. Finally, joining the invasion would be an important show of solidarity with the UK's principal ally, the US. The Anglo-American alliance underpinned UK foreign policy, and there were concerns that essential areas of cooperation between the two allies would be damaged if the UK did not fully support US over Iraq. An initial assessment might suggest that the UK's decision to join the invasion would have been an irrational choice because the disadvantages overwhelmingly outweigh the advantages. However, the Iraq inquiry considers the alliance was a determining factor in the government's decision over Iraq. Essentially, the alliance dependence bargain was that the UK, the conventionally weaker ally, would staunchly and publicly support the US in exchange for the ability to influence US policy while pursuing UK national interests. In the case of the Iraq invasion, the UK resisted myopic temptation to free ride and prioritize alliance maintenance over other rational considerations. The UK instead chose to share the burden of the US and ensure the continuance of the alliance due to the security, diplomatic, and economic benefits. Therefore, the importance of the Anglo-American alliance outweighed the risks of international and domestic backlash. We now move on to the behavioral model of decision-making. BM regards alliance dependence as a tradition and guiding principle of British foreign policy. It's unlikely that adopting a conflicting position over Iraq would have critically damaged the alliance. Historically, differing and even conflicting positions over major issues did not cast doubts on the alliance. The UK was unyielding to requests for forced contributions to the Vietnam War, despite the US using their leverage of the UK's dependence on US loans. In contrast, the UK's decision to join the invasion of Iraq lacked sustained and direct pressure from the US. The US made clear that they would have invaded Iraq even if the UK was unable to commit forces. Bush had even personally told Blair that that UK forces could keep out of offensive military actions in Iraq if public opinion in UK remained harsh. Therefore, the alliance would likely endure even if UK did not join the Iraq invasion. Instead, BM emphasizes the importance of Blair's personalization of the Anglo-American alliance. Blair mistakenly equated a close relationship with Bush with leverage over US foreign policy. His goal was to become Bush's friend, use his friendship to exert influence over US foreign policy, then maintain his perceived influence over the US to exercise great power status and achieve goals at the international level. In reality, Blair had little influence over the Bush administrations. For instance, Blair ultimately failed to ensure US support for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in exchange for UK support in the Iraq invasion. Therefore, although alliance dependence was a key factor in the UK's decision to join the invasion, publicly supporting the US might have been more important to Blair than opposition from the international community. Finally, individual irrationality, more specifically, Blair's orientation to his political environment, explains his confidence in challenging domestic political constraints. Using profiling, one article found that Blair can be predicted to challenge domestic political constraints and prioritize strategic considerations. Blair faced significant opposition from his own governing Labour Party, most of whom did not believe there was sufficient evidence to justify invading Iraq. He narrowly won the parliamentary vote to join the invasion. The February 15 Stop the War rally against military intervention in Iraq had 1 million demonstrators and was the largest demonstration in the UK. Opinion polls showed that the public approval of his performance averaged 33% from September 2002 to March 2003. However, Blair had an overwhelming certainty and confidence in his own judgment and believed that he could carry the people with him. When he was warned that strong public opposition could preclude the UK's involvement in the war, he maintained that the British public would support regime change if the political context is right. Therefore, Blair believed that a decision to join the invasion could overcome strong domestic constraints and prioritize the needs of alliance maintenance. To summarize, an initial assessment finds that the disadvantages initially outweigh the advantages due to strong opposition from the international community, from the parliament, and from the public. However, RAM finds that there were more incentives because the dynamics of alliance dependence make the maintenance of the Anglo-American alliance a particularly important strategic consideration. In contrast, BM rejects the overemphasis of alliance maintenance. Historically, the Anglo-American alliance has survived conflicting positions. Rather, Blair's individual biases privilege alliance maintenance over domestic political constraints. Blair's personalization of the alliance and his overestimation of his personal influence over the Bush administration contributed to increased privilege of alliance maintenance in decision-making. Finally, Blair's orientation to his political environment and confidence in challenging domestic political constraints disposed him to prioritize strategic imperatives over domestic political constraints. Therefore, the behavioral model is better at explaining the decision-making process of Tony Blair and that privileged alliance maintenance over domestic political constraints. RM conceptualizes a state as a unitary actor pursuing national interests. So decisions made by the leader are regarded as decisions of the state itself. In doing so, RAM ignores the significance of imperfect human reasoning and individual bias. BM addresses this limitation by focusing on the role of individual psychology in UK's decision to join the invasion. Next, BM judges that it would be inaccurate to
Sorry, Grace, your time is up. I'm so sorry. Yeah, there are now 5 minutes for the question and answers. Judges, do you have any questions? The platform is now open to the audience. Do you have any questions? You could either text it on the chat option, or you could tell me and I could unmute you. And yeah, do you have any questions? All right, I think there are no questions. Moving on to our second presenter. Our second presenter is Dorothy Mason. You may start.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dorothy, and today I'm presenting my honours research, Contested Terrains, Land Governance Reform during Myanmar's Democratic Transition. I want to start with a moment of rupture. As many of you will probably be aware, on the 1st of February this year, the Myanmar Armed Forces, the Tatmadaw, staged a military coup, arresting the country's democratically elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, and several other key figures in her National League for Democracy government. And this is a very kind of dark, I suppose, moment in Myanmar's recent history, because it appears to close the door quite firmly on the past decade of what appeared to be moving towards democratic and civilian governance, a more progressive governance with a democratic leadership. The past decade in Myanmar has been one of immense social, political, and economic change, as it began to transition away from military rule towards democratic government in those years. And part of my research now, in the context of the political uncertainty that's gripping Myanmar at the moment, tries to understand some of the reform programs that happened in this decade, and specifically land reform. I want to try to understand what was achieved by changes to land governance that were enacted in the 2010s during this democratic transition. Because it was a moment of immense dynamic change in the land sector. Who benefited from those changes? And more broadly, what does this tell us about state authority during this political moment in Myanmar's history? So I undertook 12 semi-structured interviews over Zoom with key individuals who worked for civil society organizations and international NGOs supporting the government's land reform program between 2010 and the recent coup. And my research tries to center their critical reflections on the work that they were doing at the time, their organization's objectives, and the relationship that they had with government and other key actors to try and answer these questions. And I also supported that data with literature review and a systematic review of NGO documents published in English on the land reform processes at the time. My key sort of argument, I suppose, is that in some ways, the land reforms of the 2010s seem to pull in two different directions. On the one hand, you have legal changes earlier on in the transition government that seem to entrench patterns of violence and dispossession that privilege elite interests by essentially formalizing land transfers from farmers to private companies, often with links to the military, under the kind of purported intention of trying to improve agricultural productivity. But on the other hand, you also have what appears to be quite genuine engagements with civil society groups at this time at the policy level, which ultimately increase the visibility of land conflicts and help to strengthen civil society movements. So I'll go through each of these in turn. So to start with, there's a series of, or two key laws that were passed early in the regime, which appeared to entrench elite dynamics around land and entrench many of the patterns of dispossession around land that were common across previous authoritarian regimes. The Farmland Law and the Vacant, Fallow and Virgin Land Management Law, both passed in 2012, mobilized historic discourses around productivity and wasteland, but repackaged them, I suppose, in alignment with market-oriented development discourses around agricultural development, which promote land rights formalization as the foundation of a stable and prosperous economy. The Farmland Law introduces permanent land title to farmers in a way of trying to formalize and secure their land tenure. But the VFV law, the Vacant, Fallow and Virgin Land Management Law, codes all unregistered, untitled lands as vacant and therefore available for development and investment by domestic companies, many of whom have links to the military. So under these two laws, I argue, really have to be understood in concert with one another. Because on the one hand, you have a law that formalizes private tenure, but another that excludes all other kinds of farming practices that cannot acquire that tenure. And so together, these laws essentially commoditize land and facilitate the transfer of untitled, unregistered lands into the hands of crony companies. And I have here an image of an agribusiness concession, which is highly militarized. So a process, I suppose, of transferring land from farmers to agribusinesses and entrenching elite dynamics in doing so. On the other hand, though, this period is marked by sustained and what appears to be quite genuine and concerted engagement with civil society, and an administration that begins to open conversations around land rights that increase visibility for struggles and contests over land between farmers and a centralizing, territorializing state. And this was partly a result of top-down pressure from external donors and international foreign businesses who were eager to promote a more transparent and coherent land governance framework in order to ensure greater security for their investments. But it was also the result of concerted bottom-up pressure from grassroots organizations whose struggles over land, which have been ongoing since long before the democratic transition and during the democratic period, helped to make land an agenda in the transition government in the first place. And the key document that comes out of these participatory processes is the National Land Use Policy, which is a document drawn up with extensive consultation between government, donors and civil society organizations, including grassroots organizations. And this kind of progressive engagement and consultation processes it resulted in the inclusion of progressive policy in the National Land Use Policy, including significantly the recognition of customary tenure. And this is particularly significant because customary tenure or shifting cultivation is directly threatened by those two earlier laws, the Farmland Law and the Vacant, Fallow and Virgin Land Management Law. So how can we understand this practice of, on the one hand, laws which appear to entrench conservative interests and historic and violent patterns of land appropriation and dispossession, and on the other hand, a very well-funded, concerted effort to engage with grassroots organizations in conversations around land struggles. I think that there's, I suppose, two important things that I want to say here about about this, and it comes down to, I guess, how we understand this democratic government and this government in this period of transition. On the one hand, the land administration under the progressive transitional regime and then subsequently the democratic regime remained highly fragmented, with powerful vested interests continuing to play a role and occupy positions of power in the land administration, including military actors. So at the policy level, you have vested interests at play. But also at the implementation level, there's also sustained and entrenched military interests at the local level as well, because most of the more local level civil servants and politicians, I suppose, are also military affiliated. So you have a lot of individuals at the implementation level who are interested, also who have an interest in maintaining the status quo. And I have a quote here from an interview that I did that I think illustrates this point. So how do we make sense of this? I think I'm trying to argue that Myanmar's land reforms in the 2010s are kind of caught between, on the one hand, the territorializing efforts of a central state and the democratic demands of an increasingly active and visible civil society. And while the implementation of these reforms was ultimately hindered by powerful conservative forces within the administration, including vested military interests at multiple levels, the importance of the processes that these reforms engage with should not be underestimated. Because for the first time in 60 years, the central state showed itself willing to engage with grassroots conflicts around land. And that has opened and enabled conversations around
Sorry,
land.
Dorothy, the time is up. Sorry.
Yeah,
The platform is open to the judges. Do you have any questions? Audience, do you have any questions? Please feel free to write it on the chat box.
Should we use the chat box or the Q&A function?
I think it's the chat box. That's what I have been told. But if you have any question, Grace, you can unmute yourself and ask the question as well.
I just want to say, Dorothy, it's really interesting research. I wonder what inspired you to undertake this research.
Thanks. I think I came to it through a long journey, I suppose. I traveled to Myanmar in 2017. I was really fortunate to go with the ANU. They're running like a course there, a winter course. And I think since then I've gravitated towards researching and studying Myanmar. And I think my interest in land, I'm not sure where that comes from, I suppose. I think obviously contests over resources and over land are really essential in state making processes and in kind of contested environments like Myanmar's, understanding how different actors in government compete with one another over resources in order to entrench their political power. I think it's really important to understanding how they enact political power over the country as well. That makes sense. But, yeah.
Is there any other question?
Am I allowed to go back and just ask a quick question?
Yes.
Awesome. You're saying that if the farmers are able to like prove that they own the land, that they then have rights to it to be able to farm it. How are those particularly down at the grassroots level, particularly if like that group of people are being quite oppressed by the military regime, how are they then enabled to prove ownership of the farm? Or because they have been oppressed, they don't have that ability, and then they've essentially their land gets kind of taken away from them because of that second law that you discussed.
That's a great question. So it's quite interesting because if we didn't have time to go into this, but I suppose when looking at the actual geography of land titles, there's a really clear pattern that emerges, which is that farmers that actually already have documents that prove that they have been tilling land, like tax receipts, for example, generally can get land title. So essentially it means that land title, this formalized land title, is given to farmers whose land is actually already recognized by the state. They've already been paying taxes to the state under previous regimes to prove that they've been using it. But farmers who farm land in areas that are not recognized by the state, which is usually conflict areas and frontier regions, who don't have these kinds of documents because they have never been recognized by the state, they can't get title. So these new formalized systems, they kind of mobilize very old discourses and patterns of dispossession that were existent before the system. I don't know if that really answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Alrighty. Moving on to our final presenter, Olivia Nolan. Please start when you feel free. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Olivia Nolan, and today I will be talking about the causes and consequences of the Third Taiwan conflict that spanned from 1995 to 1996. Taiwan. Many scholars have called it the next global flashpoint, as China's increasing military presence around Taiwan increases underlying tensions. In this current geopolitical climate, I think it's important that we look at past crises between the two actors to predict and forecast the outcomes and actions of China and Taiwan in a future conflict. My study specifically looks at major causes of the most recent Taiwan conflict in 1995 to 1996, arguing that Taiwan's democratization, internal power struggles within China, and America's ambiguous policy stance towards Taiwan all prevented a peaceful unification between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. By looking at the escalation and management of the crisis and reviewing a series of primary and secondary sources, the study finds that deft diplomacy is vital to diffusing tensions and addressing misperceptions. Before we get started, I think it's crucial that we look at the background to the crisis and the background to the relationship between China and Taiwan. So the underlying dispute itself dates back to the Chinese Civil War. The Kuomintang, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to Taiwan and declared Taiwan as the Republic of China. Conversely, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China as the motherland and Taiwan as a part of the PRC. Despite these ideological differences that defined the 50s and 60s, there was an economic interaction that began in the 80s and 90s between China and Taiwan. And in fact, by 1995, indirect trade between the two was worth more than $20 billion. Despite this burgeoning economic interaction, Taiwan's democratization in the 90s impeded upon any real political cooperation. At the time, under Taiwan President Lee Teng-hu's pragmatic diplomacy, Taiwan was trying to garnish international support by becoming a democracy through elections planned in 1996. And consequently, this began to engender anxiety within the CCP that the Taiwan, a part of its motherland, was trying to remove or split away. Another thing that's important to consider with underlying tensions is US relations with Taiwan. So at the time, the US had dedicated itself to a one China policy, the notion that Taiwan was a part of the PRC. However, there was a series of events that undermined this. One of these most notably included America's massive increase in arms sales to Taiwan in 1992. And you can see in the figure here, it was absolutely astronomical increase between 1991 and 1992. So in terms of the proximate cause of this crisis, it was President Lee Tang-Hu's trip to America in June of 1995. As seen here on the right, he attended Cornell University in 1995, giving quite a provocative speech which promoted Taiwan's democratization and actually explicitly mentioned Taiwan as the Republic of China 27 times, which was obviously in complete contrast to Beijing's policy. I interviewed an academic, Gary Klingworth, who referred to this as kind of the last straw in a string of grievances for Beijing. And they saw this act as not only furthering Taiwan's independence movement, but US complicity in this as undermining Beijing's sovereignty. So in terms of what escalated the crisis, one of the main factors was hardliners within the CCP and the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army. So President Jiang Zemin, who was newly elected in China at the time, was criticised for permitting Taiwan splittist activities to occur. In fact, about 6,000 letters from PLA officials and businessmen were sent to the CCP, warning that the younger brother needs to toe the Chinese line. And consequently, in this climate, to survive the power politics and to placate military hardliners, President Jiang turned to military coercion by beginning a series of missile testing from 1995 to March of 1996 around Taiwan to try and mitigate any further Taiwanese independence efforts. On the other hand, America's ambiguity and kind of in terms of its policy stance towards Taiwan made it difficult to defuse the crisis. So Clinton himself was unable to coherently articulate US security interests. And interviewing a few scholars and looking at the literature, for China especially, they misperceived this as US allowing for the missile tests to continue without reaction or action with regards to American military force. However, at the time, you've also got the domestic climate of the US. So there was massive Republican-dominated Congress that began criticizing Clinton, the president at the time, for appeasing China. And interviewing another scholar, Nancy Tucker, she was explaining to me that in this climate, in China's kind of increasing military tests in 1996, Clinton saw this as the perfect opportunity to show that he wasn't a pushover. And by declaring military force from the US, it also cemented the idea that America was a major strategic ally within the Asia Pacific for the other nations. In terms of the management, as I mentioned, America did actually deploy 2 aircraft carriers, which was actually the largest show of military force since the 1950s in the Vietnam War. And this successfully diffused the crisis for a few reasons. The first of which is that it highlighted to China its own military ineptitude in comparison to the US. And, all on board the NITS, which is the aircraft carrier, one of them of the US, noted that the missile firing stopped when they approached the station. So it shows the successfulness of their military force and might. Another thing that managed the crisis itself was China's clear signaling. So they defined the locations and the duration of its missile tests to both Taipei and Washington, which showed the others that it wasn't, direct military aggression, but more in a sense, military posturing. And Li and Zhang actually spoke indirectly through unofficial intermediaries, which Andrew Scoble, another scholar that I interviewed, explained that this signalling from a distance ensured to reconcile differences and mitigate any misperceptions. In terms of the evaluation of the crisis itself, it was a short-term success for China. Taiwan did moderate its behaviour. It promised no further visits to the US, and it promoted this idea of prolonged peace, with a new era of Beijing-Taipei détente ensuing. With Washington, as you can see in this photo here, China and Washington began to reconcile that differences, and Washington realigned with the One China policy and adopted the Three No's policy, which was this notion, or at the crux of it, was that US would only intervene if China invaded Taiwan directly. However, there was some shortcomings to China's military posturing. Only 18% of Taiwanese voters in March 1996 actually desired reunification in the long run. So despite China's military posturing with its goal to, I guess, mitigate Taiwanese independence efforts, fundamental differences still remained between the two. By 1999, in fact, Taiwanese supported independence climbed to roughly about 57% of the population. And despite US dedicating itself to the One China policy, the US-Taiwan military-to-military relationship was upgraded with a series of unofficial defense visits from Taiwan defense officials to the US thereafter. So just to conclude and summarize my findings, I looked at the underlying causes, the proximate cause, escalation, and management to kind of come to the conclusion that it's really important that as these kind of underlying tensions began to rise to the surface again, we maintain cooperation, clear signaling, and America maintains a coherent policy stance to reconcile differences and ensure that misperceptions don't lead to a future direct conflict between China, the US, and Taiwan. Thank you so much.
All right. Now, did we have any questions from the judges, please?
Oh yeah, I have a question. So I guess the sort of like the, I don't know, the elephant in the room, I guess, is how closely does this mirror the kind of things that happened previous to this with the conflicts between the superpowers, such as the US, United States, and the Soviet Union before? Like some of the lessons seem to be parallel to the lessons that were drawn from that kind of cold conflict. And I guess the other kind of elephant, the other half of the elephant, is that these tensions really haven't gone away. So like, are we still, still the same lessons apply, or do we have a question over the evaluation of these lessons learned?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and thank you, Robert. I think that there is a lot of lessons and parallels that can be taken on from past relationships, and I think that was the main reason I decided to study past crises between China and US and Taiwan, because there's a lot of mistakes that I think are being replicated in terms of ambiguity in policies, unwillingness to really reconcile differences, and really lack of clear signaling that prevented the Taiwan crisis that I study kind of resulting in direct military conflict. And I think that if these things do not remain, if they don't remain resolved in the future, that we could see a conflict. I don't know if it necessarily be military just because of the high economic costs, but I do think that we can learn from past crises and apply them to now, whether that is with US, China, Taiwan, or US, China, Soviet. So I do think it is important to look at past crises, especially if they are those elephants in the room.
Did we have any other questions from the judges or the audience? Yep. Yep. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you, judges Robert Fleet and Miss Hannah Clark, and congratulations to our student presenters. This recording will be made available online on following the conference, and we hope to see you in other conference sessions this week. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.